The Law of Return represents one of the earliest laws that's passed in Israel. It's passed by the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, Knesset, Knesset. And I think that we can see most of what's in the Law of Return in light of really one particular part of the Declaration of the State of Israel. On page 165, it says, survivors of the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, as well as Jews from other parts of the world, continue to migrate to Eretz Israel. Right? So that declaration sets up Israel as, above all things, a place of refuge for Jews from political oppression. So this law of Israel, established in 1950, speaks to, I mean, the law of return that's in the in these laws about Israel. It really is framed by a conception of Israel as being a political refuge, that, like, regardless of religious, political, economic ideology, that's actually separate from a more pragmatic role for the state of Israel to be a place of refuge for Jews, and that it conceptualizes the state of Israel then as the rightful home of every Jew. And that's really what the Law of Return says. The Law of Return says any Jew can go to the state of Israel and almost immediately become a citizen, that they can ask for citizenship and gain it. And it doesn't really matter what kind of Jew they are, practicing or not practicing, at least early on. Over time, we see that there are more complicated statements about what a Jew can and can't do to be counted as a Jew in the state of Israel, right? So with this legislation, we see that there's something very, very different about a political Jewish entity from any other Jewish community. That this is one that can actually fully regulate who counts as Jewish and what counts as an acceptable way to be Jewish. So one of the main things early on is Jewishness is defined by ethnicity, somewhat teleologically. And so we have this question of, like, how do you prove Jewishness, which for some people is a little hard, but for most is pretty easy. So in thinking about this as a place of refuge, in particular from the Nazi Holocaust, anyone is Jewish if they have even one grandparent who's Jewish. That's not just a random way to make the law. That reflects Nazi policy. That if anyone had a grandparent who was Jewish, they were counted as Jewish by the Nazi regime. So if it's a refuge, it has to be a refuge for people who are counted as Jews in other places that persecute Jews. And the creation of the state so quickly follows the heels of the Nazi regime. It's not, I think, fair to say that it's directly connected, that we have to see a little bit more about what happens over time, but it is correct to say that the Holocaust weighs really heavily in the mind of most Israelis, that most Israelis had families who they left behind, probably in Europe, or if not that, then at least friends, if they happen to be second or third generation Israelis, or sabras, actually, as they're called, which is a cactus that people thought was indigenous. So when Jews were born in Israel, they were often called sabras, even when it was not yet the state of Israel, when it was Palestine as part of either the Ottoman Empire or the British Mandate, that Jews born in the land of Israel were called sabras. It actually turns out that cactus isn't indigenous, which just winds up mirroring the actually a lot of the questions about what constitutes legitimate nationalism. But this law, right, is really conceptually about who can get refuge there. And so we see that specifically it refers to a child and a grandchild of a Jew, the spouse of a Jew, the spouse of a child of a Jew. That all of these things are sort of recognitions of the fact that lots of Jews are not necessarily married to other Jews, or their whole family was not necessarily, their ancestors were not necessarily Jews. But these are people who understand themselves to be Jewish. Jewish culture may be a very big part of their life. But regardless of that, they may also be um, still refugees from the Nazi Holocaust. That it took a very long time after the Holocaust to really deal with all of the people who were liberated or came out of hiding in Europe. And that kind of time period actually is what ultimately convinces people that after the Holocaust is over, um, Jews go from being in concentration camps and death camps to being in displaced persons camps, or DP camps, as they're called. And the DP camps became the kind of intractable problem in 1946, well, in late 1945 and really in 1946, where other countries began to see really actually a need for the state of Israel. That some Jews did return to Eastern Europe, and often they were met with violence, or they certainly weren't able to get their old homes back and things like that. And so maybe they went to Eastern Europe, but then they returned back to DP camps. Maybe they went back to places like Romania or Bulgaria that suddenly were making a shift toward a certain version of communism that didn't seem to envision Jewishness as a part of it. All these different kind of complications of suddenly people needing a state. And it's important that virtually no state wanted to accept these Jews. So the United States, as of 1921 and 1924, had laws against immigration and didn't make any kind of exception even for refugees of the Holocaust until the early 50s. Maybe 250, 300,000 refugees were able to come to the US, but for the most part, that wasn't an option for the US. So politically, as the US, under Harry Truman's administration, turns to think of the state of Israel as legitimate in becoming a Jewish state rather than becoming a liberal democracy or even a binational democracy in which both Jews and Palestinians might have kind of national citizenship of belonging. Um, it becomes a Jewish state as different countries are pushing the UN to see that as a legitimate choice for what to do to end the British mandate. That basically, as soon as Britain got control of the area, they realized they had control of kind of a disaster, of a place that's in chaos. That with the Balfour Declaration in 1917, there actually was a turn that early on, many Palestinians worked with Jews, especially those who were working with a socialist mentality, and hired a lot of Arab labor. But after the Balfour Declaration, there suddenly began to be kind of outbreaks of violence of Palestinians and other Arabs living in the area who saw Jews as actually ultimately trying to take their land away, who, even as Jews, who, even as Israelis or future Israelis, Zionists, saw themselves as pushing against British colonialism and even the sort of object of British colonialism. Indigenous Arabs saw Zionists as actually connected to British colonialism and as the recipients of a set of privileges from that colonialism. And the law of return has often been seen that way. That for Jews, for Zionists, for whether it was people who moved to Israel or not, the idea of a law of return that granted every Jew a right and that saw this as the original homeland of all Jews, even if people hadn't had ancestors who lived there for nearly 2 millennia, it was really important symbolically. The law of return has also since been a kind of sticking point in peace talks between the State of Israel and Palestinians, that today Palestinians really want um, their own law of return or right of return to whatever territories are declared Palestinian, which might not actually be where their families are from. Their homes may have been destroyed. They have keys even to their former homes. These are kind of symbolic things. And that there's really, I think, a sense we have to see that in the politics here, that these are that there are multiple groups who, for various sometimes generous and sometimes self-interested reasons, have a lot to say about who should be allowed to be a citizen. But this law has stayed in place; it remains in place. But we see that the kind of one little sticking point is that the law, as described on page 167, says, "For the purposes of this law, a Jew means a person who was born of a Jewish mother or has become converted to Judaism and who is not a member of another religion." So there's a really famous case about someone who was hidden as a child in a monastery and grew up that way, but then later found out that he was Jewish, and he was put in the monastery to be hidden. It's called the Brother Daniel case. And that was really definitive. He wanted to continue practicing what he had grown up with in the monastery, even as he wanted to reclaim his Jewishness, including to move to the State of Israel. And it went before the Israeli Supreme Court, and ultimately they decided that he was not Jewish according to this law, that because he didn't want to give up the Catholicism that he had practiced, that he didn't count as a citizen. And so that really set a precedent, as laws do, for thinking about who counts as an Israeli citizen. And so they're right, this idea of having a parent or a grandparent who's Jewish, ultimately, there is often still a question of what's Jewish enough. Or it says a person who has become converted to Judaism, but the State of Israel is linked to a rabbinate that has the right to decide for marriage and for citizenship who counts as eligible as Jewish, and the rabbinate only accepts Orthodox practices. And so if someone is an ethnic Jew but they grew up in Reform or Conservative Judaism, that's no problem for the State of Israel because ethnically they're Jewish. We have this kind of parent thing. But if someone, either they or even their parents or their grandparents, particularly their mother or their grandmother, did a conservative or a reform conversion, the Orthodox rabbinate doesn't consider that legitimate Judaism, and so doesn't consider it a legitimate conversion, and therefore that person is not eligible for Jewishness. They would have to undergo an Orthodox conversion to become religiously Jewish enough to emigrate. But as we see, that's really separate from the concept of ethnic identity and the practice of Jewishness for many Jews, that is unrelated to religion, which we can take to mean halakha here. So it's very, very complicated, and the place of religion in Jewishness really shifts all the time, even as it's written into the law of return.